It is roughly 2:15 a.m. on the morning of April the 15th, 1912. At this current time, the RMS Titanic is in her final stages of life. The ship's bow at this point had completely filled with water and was now several hundred feet beneath the surface, while the ship's stern, which still had a lot of air in it and was still positively buoyant, was resisting the pull of the bow, and as the bow sank deeper and deeper into the sea, the stern was slowly rising higher and higher into the air. Now, this act put a lot of strain on the Titanic's hull in places where those who designed the ship didn't expect there to be much strain at all. Now, the Titanic did hold itself together for a time, but eventually the strain was too much and the Titanic broke in two. The ship broke in two just forward of the Titanic's third funnel, and once the break happened, the Titanic's bow basically broke apart and sank straight to the bottom of the Atlantic. Now, where the Titanic's stern still had a lot of air in it, it did linger on the surface for a time while the water made its way into the ship. However, eventually the Titanic's stern joined the Titanic's bow and sank to the bottom of the Atlantic at roughly 2:20 a.m. Now, despite the fact that both pieces of the Titanic sank in relatively the same place, you would think that the Titanic's bow and stern, despite being in two pieces, would actually be sitting pretty close together at the bottom of the Atlantic. However, this isn't the case. If you were to dive the wreck of the Titanic, you may be shocked to discover that the Titanic's bow and stern sections are actually separated by around 2,000 feet of distance. And on top of that, the Titanic's stern section, well, it isn't even facing the bow anymore. It's actually facing in the opposite direction of the bow section. How on earth could this have happened? Well, that's what we're going to be exploring in today's video. I hope you enjoy. Special thanks to Titanic Honor and Glory for providing some of the sinking animations you're going to see in today's video. Please check out their work in the description below. Now, the first thing we need to discuss in order for all of you to properly understand the positions of the bow and stern sections of Titanic is we need to go over the way that the bow and stern sections of the ship were built, because the way they were built would play a huge role in how these pieces would end up at the bottom of the ocean. Have you ever noticed that the bow of the Titanic, well, the very front of the ship, if you look at it right, it kind of looks like a triangle. You've got both sides of the Titanic's hull, and they converge together at the very front of the ship, and they make a single point at the very front of the Titanic. We see that point at the very front of the ship, where everything becomes very narrow and connected together. This part of the ship is known as the prow. And the prow of a ship is designed to be able to easily slice through the waters of the Atlantic while the ship is in motion. And then once this happens, the water then flows along the Titanic's hull, because the further aft you go from the prow, you'll notice that the hull of the ship gets wider and then it kind of curves and then goes further aft, This was designed this way in order to allow the water to have an easy path to flow around the Titanic's hull while the vessel was in motion. Now, because the bow piece of Titanic was designed this way, well, after the bow of Titanic sank and began its journey to the bottom of the ocean, she behaved during her journey to the bottom in a very similar way to how she would behave if this piece of the Titanic was still on the surface and then just sailing along. You see, as the bow of the Titanic headed for the bottom, the very front of the ship, the prow, moved through the water first. It was the part that was aimed down with the rest of the ship behind it. And then the prow simply allowed the water, it pushed the water, and the water flowed along the Titanic's hull and then just traveled aft. So because of this, the bow of the Titanic headed for the bottom very stably. She was just heading for the bottom, just like she would at the surface. Now, the bow part of Titanic was so hydrodynamically stable that, believe it or not, for lack of a better term, I guess, the bow of the Titanic actually developed a tiny bit of lift as she was heading for the bottom of the ocean. Now, when I say she developed some lift, what I mean is it was very minimal. So the ship is heading straight down, okay? But the bow piece slowly panned up a little bit, and the ship moved a little bit forward while she was going down. So the best way I can put this into words is, let's say you're taking 6 steps down, okay? Well, for every 6 steps down, the Titanic would move 1 step forward. That's the easiest way I can describe it. So You can see evidence of this panning forward if we take a look at the wreck of the bow section today. You'll notice that the very front of the bow section is actually dug in a little bit deeper into the seafloor than what it is the further aft you go. This was because of the slight panning forward motion. So with all of this evidence that we just went over, this is why the Titanic's bow section looks the way that it does and why it ultimately ended up landing the way it did at the bottom of the ocean. Okay, so now that you understand how the bow section ended up at the bottom, let's now talk about the stern section. You see, if you thought that the stern section headed to the bottom of the ocean in a similar way to the bow section, well, unfortunately, I have to tell you that you couldn't be more wrong. You see, because the stern section was never designed to take on the full force of the ocean head-on like the bow section was, the water didn't have an easy way to flow around the stern section as it was heading for the bottom of the ocean. So, because this was the case, as the stern headed for the bottom, the pressure of the rushing water going past it, well, it began to rip everything off of the stern. The stern section, like big chunks of the ship began to fly off, things were spilling out of it. And the stern section actually began to develop a spiral and spin effect. So as the stern fell through the water, she was spinning around with big chunks of the ship flying off the further and further down she went. And you see, what made this effect even worse was the fact that, when the stern of the Titanic left the surface, it still had a lot of air in it, unlike the bow section. So because this was the case, around 10 or 20 seconds after the stern left the surface, the survivors of the Titanic disaster said that they heard and felt what they thought at the time was an underwater explosion. But in reality, what this was, it was the stern of the Titanic imploding as the pressure of all the ocean around it got so great that it ended up just crushing the stern section. Once this happened, the spiraling and breaking apart of the stern only got worse. The stern honestly didn't just flow through the water like the bow section did, She basically was just this big, huge chunk of metal in free fall and spiraling all the way to the bottom of the ocean. So now that you understand how both the Titanic's bow and stern section traveled to the bottom of the Atlantic, the last and final thing we need to discuss in this video is the sheer amount of distance that both pieces had to travel to reach the bottom of the Atlantic. Don't forget that the area where the Titanic sank, well, the ocean is 2.5 miles deep in that area. I mean, that's an insane amount of distance to think about. So, when you take this distance into consideration, and then you think about the two very different ways that the Titanic's bow and stern sections travel to the bottom, you've got the bow section traveling almost straight down but doing the slight panning forward motion. You've got the spiraling of the stern. Well, suddenly it does make sense how both the bow and stern sections of the ship would end up around 2,000 feet apart from each other. And this also explains why the Titanic's stern section is facing the opposite direction of the bow. Because the stern was doing this spiraling effect all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, well, it just happened to land at the bottom facing the opposite direction than the bow. So yeah, guys, with that, now all of you watching this video now understand how both halves of Titanic ended up at the bottom of the ocean, and you also understand why there is such a huge distance between both halves of the ship. It honestly just has to do with how each half of the ship was shaped and built, and it also has to do with how they fell at the bottom of the ocean and how the water affected them and so on and so forth. But yeah, guys, with that, that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to leave it a like. If you're new here, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys so much. It really helps out a lot. Oh, and for you Minecraft players out there, you may be happy to know that I did create a Minecraft server for the Historic Travels YouTube channel and Discord. If you would like to join it and come and hang out with all of us, yes, I do play it often. I will have the IP address for the Minecraft server in the description below. It is the Java one, by the way. All right, everybody. Well, hey, I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Special thanks to my captain level Patreon supporter, Tammy Lee. Thank you so much for all the support.